Good afternoon and welcome to this Bright Blue event, A Real Choice, the virtual Parliament Beyond the Pandemic, in partnership with the Centenary Action Group. I'm Phoebe Arcelon-Wakefield, researcher at Bright Blue, which is an independent liberal conservative think tank. Our research focuses on social, economic and environmental policy. For those who are tweeting during the event, please use the handle @WeAreBrightBlue and the hashtag #VirtualParliament. Over the course of the pandemic, as workplaces up and down the country were forced to adopt a completely new way of doing things, so was Parliament. The introduction of virtual measures has facilitated the full, remote participation of MPs who may otherwise have been unable to physically attend. However, the current plan is to scrap virtual measures when pandemic restrictions end and go back to the old way of doing things. Our panellists, who I will shortly introduce, we'll be discussing whether that is actually the right decision and what could be gained if the option of virtual participation is retained for parliamentarians, making the hybrid parliament model permanent. Afterwards, I'll get the discussion going and put your questions to the panelists in the Q&A section. You can submit questions throughout the event via Slido, either by clicking the link in the description of this stream on YouTube or by going to Slido itself and using the code BRIGHTBLUE. I will now introduce our excellent panelists, and afterwards they will each speak for 5 minutes on the benefits, challenges and possible barriers to retaining virtual measures in Parliament. Karen Bradley MP, former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, is chair of the Procedure Select Committee and has represented Staffordshire Moorlands since 2010. Lord Anderson of Ipswich, a barrister, is a member of the EU Security and Justice Subcommittee and formerly independent reviewer of terrorism legislation in the UK. Resham Kotecha is an Associate Fellow at Bright Blue, Head of Engagement for Women to Win, and founder and director of the Conservative Policy Network. And Dr. Jessica C. Smith is a lecturer in politics at the University of Southampton and author of the Remotely Representative House Report. Karen, could I ask you to kick us off with your 5 minutes, please?
Of course, and thank you so much, Phoebe. It's a pleasure to be here. When looking at these questions, I suppose we've always before theoretically thought, what might a hybrid parliament look like? And for the first time, we actually now have the evidence. We now have done the real life trial of it. Now, albeit we didn't trial every possible option on a hybrid parliament. We for example, didn't explore the technology that might have allowed for interventions in debates, which I think we could have done, but we didn't. And obviously we were forced into this. So there was a slight unwillingness, I think it'd be fair to say, from many people to go down the route of a hybrid parliament. But we now have that real life trial, and we've now got the evidence of how this can work and some of the possibilities of what could happen in the future. So perhaps if I just talk about the pros and cons, so the things that have been good and the things that weren't so good or maybe could have been improved. So starting with what was good. Well, the first thing is Parliament was able to meet, and forced into this unprecedented situation in March 2020, there was a view that could Parliament actually continue? Could we physically be in Parliament if the rules that were being applied to the country were work from home if you can, and also travel only if absolutely essential? The idea that 650 MPs would spend hours and hours, and in my case it's a minimum of 3 hours each way, travelling between their constituency and Westminster to participate in debates, staying in two places, possibly having to stay in a hotel, all of the things that we were telling the public not to do, was quite difficult to consider. And we started off by introducing virtual meetings for select committees, and certainly my procedure committee met through the whole of the Easter recess back in March and April last year to discuss what might be possible. And then when we did come back to Parliament after Easter, it was in a fully, at that point, almost fully virtual way with some physical participation. Ironically, we had to meet physically to agree to meet virtually, but that is one of the joys of parliamentary procedure. So we could continue to meet. The second point was that although I did actually participate physically on a number of occasions during that early lockdown, many people just simply couldn't. They couldn't because they had health conditions themselves, or they had caring responsibilities, or they were just physically, it was a very difficult thing. I mean, members from Northern Ireland, there were no aeroplanes at one point. So in order to have equal representation and make sure all MPs could participate, having that virtual participation and being allowed to vote remotely was absolutely essential in the first few weeks. Clearly, we moved on, obviously, from voting remotely to voting by proxy, and I'm sure we'll come on to conversations about that later, but we were at least able to continue to meet and to have equal representation. And that has meant more participation. There is no doubt about it. More MPs are putting in for more debates and for more opportunities. Now, that has some downsides, but it is a good thing to see members who perhaps wouldn't be able to participate, perhaps on a Thursday, because they have need to travel back to their constituencies. So where are the cons? Well, I think the first con, and it's a clear one, is the lack of spontaneity and interaction. So I've said that I think the technology is there that could have enabled there to be more spontaneity, but there's no doubt that to try and set up a call with a colleague to discuss a small point that you would mention to them as you pass them in the corridor or the division lobby it has really affected the way we work. And we're not as effective, I'm sure of that, because we're not all together in one place at any one point in the week. I think there's also the blurring of lines. So not only the blurring of lines between private and public life, everyone has now seen all their MPs' kitchens and offices, and they've looked at their book choices, and they've discovered all sorts of things about their MPs they perhaps didn't want to know. But it's also the blurring of the lines between parliamentary activities and constituency activities. And they are two very different things at times. And certainly what you do in your constituency impacts and is reflected in your contributions to Parliament. But when in Parliament, you're focusing on Parliament. And of course, because of Zoom and everything else, actually what we're all now doing is involved in Zoom calls with our constituents and our constituency issues, and not participating in Parliament in the way we were before. And I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing. And then I think the final point I would make in terms of the cons is that the increased participation has led to the dreaded call lists, which I don't think are necessarily a bad thing. I think they're a thing that has highlighted how many MPs are interested in speaking. But it's the main thing that people are upset about is the very short amount of time we get to speak in debates. And it has shown that those 3-minute speeches where you're just reading a speech into the record simply isn't a debate. And so I think these are the challenges we need to overcome. What happens next? Well, we obviously know what the Prime Minister said yesterday. If I was the government, I would extend the measures that are due to expire on Monday evening. I would extend them to the end of the July term so that we can come back in September afresh. Let's see what happens on that. And then I think we need to go back to normal, if there is a normal, and go back to how things were, and then assess the situation and determine what MPs want in terms of our future way of working. I think that's got to my 5 minutes, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, so I will move on to the next speaker now.
Thank you, Karen. David, can we go to you next? David, you are muted, just to let you know.
Thank you for that reminder. I'm here to tell you what's going on down the corridor in the House of Lords, where we've been working very largely virtually for 12 months now. We have very few members with young children, but there are some other particular reasons why it works well for us, at least if we remember to unmute. First, we are a part-time and unsalaried House, which sells itself on bringing to the lawmaking process current or recent experience of other jobs, whether in academia, the professions, charity sector, or business. If you can make it easier for people like that to participate, you get more out of them, especially if they live and work outside London and the South East, which have traditionally been greatly overrepresented in the membership and even more so in the work of the House of Lords. Secondly, our work is different in nature from that of the Commons. Our debates are thoughtful, but rarely lively. We have no constituents, and our core functions of revising bills and running select committees can be performed quite well in a largely virtual manner. Of course, bills don't get amended without intensive informal contact. But despite our median age of 71, that happened by Zoom, phone, email, and WhatsApp. And we were, I think, highly effective. During lockdowns, for just one example, a look at the very substantial improvements to the domestic abuse bill that were initiated in the House of Lords and accepted by the government. Another difference with the Commons is that we will decide for ourselves what procedures we adopt once the pandemic is over. We debated our future arrangements a few weeks ago, and since the government has no majority in the Lords, my best guess, and it is only a guess because no decisions have been taken, is that we will retain some aspects of what we have been doing. Under discussion are First of all, select committees. They will, as I understand, or may well be given the choice of meeting either in real life or virtually. My experience of a virtual committee was that it worked astonishingly well. The view is widely taken that hybrid committees are not as good as virtual committees. Debates in the Chamber and Committee of the House, well, we will go back probably to our old ways at the start of September, or possibly, and depending on how things go, over the next few weeks and months after the conference season. But there is a strong wish to retain the option of virtual participation as a reasonable adjustment for our severely disabled members, some of whom, like many of us, were more productive during the pandemic than ever before. If for them, then why not for people who have caring responsibilities, people who live very far away, or people who have other jobs? My understanding is that both the leader and the shadow leader of the House are currently opposed to that, but if the technology is retained, who knows what may happen in the future. Voting, finally, there is a strong feeling that remote voting should be facilitated, at least within the Palace of Westminster, whether by using Peer Hub, which is our voting app, or the card readers. Some would like to continue with fully remote voting on Peer Hub, which is what we've enjoyed over the last 12 months, even on the basis that one would not be paid any allowance for voting from home. Those people do not currently include the usual channels, though perhaps whips will take a different view if peers are no longer willing to come in for 4 days a week as at present, or as in the past. I'd like to finish with just 3 short reflections of a more general nature. First, successful though it has been, at least for us, the tech is currently the worst it's ever going to be. It was interesting to hear Karen talk about improvements that could allow interventions and debate. The tech will improve, allowing us not only to replicate things we did in real life, but to do other things better. Secondly, if we keep to our old ways, we will get even further behind the world we are supposed to be legislating for. Over the next 15 years, audit, medicine, architecture, transport will change hugely, sometimes as a result of technology not yet invented. Even the legal profession, not a progressive bastion, has cautiously embraced virtual hearings. The 4 bars of the UK declared the other day that remote working should be the default in future for short hearings that do not decide the result of a case. Then finally, R&R, restoration and renewal of the Palace of Westminster. I don't think the taxpayer should be paying for a a real life House of Lords during the decant, when we could operate virtually, or perhaps take over the temporary Commons chamber 1 day a week. And if we are going back to the chamber in 2035 or later, when all the work is finished, I really hope it is not to the working methods of a 19th century gentleman's club, congenial though some of our current members find those to be. Those are not the views of a majority of the House of Lords, but they are the views of some of us, and I hope they will get more traction in the years ahead. Thank you.
David, thank you. Rusham, can I go to you next?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, as I am neither a parliamentarian nor the author of a brilliantly researched paper, I spent some time thinking about what I could share in terms of perspectives on this. And so I want to flag this as incredibly unscientific research, but I did reach out to a group of other candidates, activists, party members, and people generally interested in politics to kind of gauge the concerns, the benefits, the pros, the cons of this. And I think some of the key things that came out were, is this just until we are through COVID, if and when that is, or is this a forever situation? Of course, there are different reactions for current MPs and future ones and different thought processes, and I'll come on to that. And finally, the group that we need to consider is constituents and democracy. And obviously, we've heard the difference from Karen and David about MPs who are democratically elected and have to interact and engage with constituents in a specific way compared to peers who don't have quite the same responsibility. But of course, we talk a lot about the benefits of being more flexible with online access, being more flexible with online voting. And I don't know for certain because it's hard to know until you do it. But the reality is it is very likely, we know this from our work at Women to Win, that women in particular who have significant caring responsibilities struggle to think of themselves as being able to serve in the role of an MP with the current timings of late votes, the travelling back and forth from constituencies, especially those further away from London. And so there is a very real possibility that offering some flexibility where required could mean that we see a parliament that includes a wider range, a broader range of people with different caring responsibilities, different abilities or disabilities, different classes, different backgrounds, different family situations. And so that in itself could be a real positive if we make Parliament something that you don't have to be able to be voting till late every single day or be in London several days a week if you've got situations that mean you can't. So we are potentially going to see an attraction of more people with different responsibilities. There's of course the environmental argument for people. I know Karen mentioned a 3-hour journey each way. There are people with much further journeys, journeys that can only be done by plane or by car at points. And so of course there is the environmental argument. And for those with young children, many candidates have spoken to me and said that they actually choose to wait until their children are old enough to be not so reliant or dependent on them to become MPs. So I think there are lots of positive arguments about the flexibility, meaning that we would see a broader range of people coming in. And of course, somebody said to me, well, if MPs weren't self-employed, it would not be considered inappropriate, weird, abnormal, or worthy of a debate to consider making accessibility changes to ensure that people could actually do their jobs remotely as and when required. So there are lots of pros. In terms of some of the concerns, I wouldn't say cons, but some of the concerns, we've seen a number of female MPs facing severe abuse online in letters and emails for taking maternity leave. And I worry that for some of our candidates going on parental leave, but particularly the women seem to get it worse, that there will be pressure that if you can vote from home, why can't you vote during your maternity leave? Or beyond that, that if you are voting from home because you have caring responsibilities or personal illnesses or a personal situation, will people feel the pressure? As Karen mentioned, we've learned a lot about our MPs, and MPs have had to share a lot about their private lives. Will there be the pressure for people to explain or justify why they're having to vote from home, and will they face abuse if they don't justify with a good enough reason? There's also concerns as somebody who wants to be an MP. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I worked in Parliament for an MP for 2 years. And it's not just about the MPs working with each other or the peers working with each other. There's a huge amount of interaction with offices whereby it is just much easier if you are working in the same location as your MP or as other parliamentary staff, other MPs, other whips. Do we create or risk creating a 2-tier system where the MPs that are in person regularly because they don't have caring responsibilities or needs to vote from home, do we create a 2-tier system where those MPs are able to network, to hobnob, to be visible in a way that the online MPs aren't? And my concern is that it's often women where childcare responsibilities fall on them, and do we risk partners of female MPs saying, well, you can come home and vote now, so why don't you come home? Or the pressure that women place on themselves to go home and look after children or elderly parents, meaning that they end up being the group of MPs that are out of Parliament more often. So is there a way we could put in systems or conditions, maybe perhaps saying that, on Mondays and Thursdays, which are generally commute to and from constituency days, that maybe those are the days where people could be flexible, so that we really do encourage the collaborative working environment where everybody's in person Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Could we say that these opportunities are available for all, but as exceptions, so where you have a need rather than just a want to work from home? So I think there is that real there's a real opportunity for potential benefit in terms of attracting a wider group of people and making the work of an MP something that is able to balance life, because of course, even though often we don't treat our politicians like real human beings, they are real human beings. They do have all of the challenges with family and personal life that we all do. So, you know, by making that easier, would we make it so that our MPs are more likely to come into Parliament and stay in Parliament beyond 1 or 2 terms, and we have the breadth and depth of experience? But how can we do it without putting a burden on MPs to out themselves? And also, how do we ensure that we enable people who are not in person to have the same level of opportunity to speak, the same visibility for select committees and for promotions, the same opportunities for cross-party working as those MPs coming in? And I would hate to see in the work of doing something with great potential that we inadvertently enable the creation of a second tier of MPs. So lots of positives, but I think we just need to think through the potential negative implications, especially on women and those with caring responsibilities.
Thank you, Resham. Jessica, your 5 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Phoebe. Yes, as mentioned, back in February, I wrote a report, The Remotely Representative House, with my colleague Professor Sarah Childs, commissioned by the Centenary Action Group, which looked at the lessons we've learned from the hybrid parliament and offered 21 recommendations outlining how the House of Commons can continue hybrid practices as we return to normal, whatever that may look like. So I just wanted to briefly speak about, I think, 3 key lessons we learned during the pandemic. And I think it brings together a lot of actually what's been said by the great contributions so far. So firstly is that the pandemic and the hybrid parliament made explicit those inequalities in representation that have previously been hidden. So one of the really powerful images of the pandemic parliament, perhaps, was that of Tracy Crouch MP, who was excluded from the debate on breast cancer while shielding at home with breast cancer. But this effective exclusion of some MPs, unable to be physically present for a myriad of reasons, is not unique to the pandemic, although it might have been magnified by it. You know, in recent years, we've seen how those old ways of working in Westminster have been inadequate. So consider those contrasting images, right, of Tulip Siddiq MP, who in the pre-pandemic parliament was pushed through the voting lobby in a wheelchair after delaying the birth of her child to vote, to Jonathan Gullis MP, who was calmly cradling his newborn baby whilst participating virtually in a select committee meeting during the hybrid parliament. And I think what we risk is that these inequalities will return if we go back to normal working. And now there's been this acceptance that there are these legitimate health and social reasons to be physically absent from the House of Commons. So that implies the same can be said for normal times too. So if we return to solely physical proceedings, this effective exclusion of some members, at times unable to be physically present, would reinstate and reproduce those inequalities amongst MPs, and constituents' rights to representation would be unnecessarily restricted once again. You know, as Karen was saying, in the pandemic, we ensured there was equal participation so that constituents wouldn't unnecessarily have their right to representation restricted. So the pandemic should lead us to ask what is needed to permit this full participation of MPs who might not always be able to be physically present. And this would include, for example, MPs who have long-term health conditions, caring commitments, suffering from bereavement, as well as those who just may be ill for shorter periods of time. And hybridity could go some way to address this and accommodate those modern ways of working. And obviously this benefits currently sitting MPs, but as we were just speaking about, it has that potential to open up the Commons to that more diverse slate of candidates in future elections. And although, as we've said, I recognise that there is some concerns around privacy of those images of MPs in their own homes, you know, sitting in front of their microwaves, a positive, a pro of that is also that potentially that normalises and demystifies the job of being an MP. And maybe if we combine that with the knowledge of that when needed, you'd be able to participate remotely, we could see a transformation who considers themselves able to fulfil the job of an MP. The second lesson we've learned, which has been touched upon by several of the speakers, is that Parliament can be innovative and world leading, right? So in its response to this crisis, like many workplaces, Parliament turned to technology. And at a really impressive speed, the House was able to put in new places of working, new ways, sorry. And the Commonwealth was widely acknowledged to have established world leading procedures, right? We were asked by other countries, by other parliaments, to share how we achieved this. And the lesson we've learned is that we now have that capacity. And this is a moment to harness the innovation that has been done. Technology has allowed for the hybrid parliament and could do more besides. So, for example, as we've discussed, perhaps allowing for interventions when participating virtually in chamber debates. And it's also removed that argument against reform, that it's simply not possible. As Karen said right at the beginning, we've done our trial of a hybrid parliament. And the final lesson is about kind of the power bases and the institution of Parliament, right? And it highlighted again what proponents of parliamentary reform often talk about, is that we lack one key voice to speak for Parliament. So unlike other parliaments, there's no central coordinating body, no CEO to flick that switch and bring about change. Rather, power is dispersed amongst key players, both government and Parliament, and they have their own opposing interests. And that means that it's been harder to bring about systematic change in the UK Parliament. And our report recognises that, and we make recommendations to a range of actors. What we really want to emphasise is that it is still for the House to decide. The House needs to decide how it continues post-pandemic. And therefore, in terms of our recommendations, we ask for a free vote on any of the measures that are put forward. So the remotely representative House starts from the premise that when there's no meaningful detriment to the overall effectiveness of the House of Commons, members should be free and entitled to decide how they participate, whether in person or remotely. That's our key lesson we can take away. And obviously this is a bold and not uncontentious claim, but it's also rather modest. So in a future House of Commons, virtual participation should be just another way of doing the job of being an MP. So there might be those MPs who always participate in person, and those whose preference or need is for virtual participation, much, if not all of the time. And as is now, it's the electorate who will decide whether they are well represented by their particular MP's way of working. So it's on these grounds that the House of Commons could continue on a hybrid basis post-pandemic. And this should be a norm for a 21st century Parliament. It would make the House of Commons a world-leading modern institution. I will pass back to Phoebe now. I'm sure there are plenty of questions from our audience.
There certainly are. Fantastic. Thank you, Jessica. So for our first question, I'd like to go to you, Karen. Do you think it's fair to say that virtual measures reduced or inhibited the ability of parliamentarians to hold the government to account during the pandemic?
Yes, I think that is undoubtedly the case. And let me give you an example of why that would be, one real life example of the way that works. So when we have questions to departments, to secretaries of state, normally there is an opportunity for members to bob, to try and catch the speaker's eye, to make an intervention during the questions. And the reason for that is things happen on the day. So I had a constituent who had, right at the beginning of the pandemic, who had a child who was overseas with a university placement in South America, and all the flights were being closed down, and they emailed me at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I went into a statement that the Foreign Secretary was giving at 7 o'clock, and I was able to bob and catch the speaker's eye, and I was able to ask a question on behalf of that constituent. Now that simply isn't possible with the system that we have at the moment, where you have to put in at least the day before. Your urgent questions, for example, are determined the day before. So an urgent question, which is one of those long questions, which is the speaker will grant, and members are allowed to apply for an urgent question, and the speaker will grant that urgent question on the basis of something that's happened on the day. That simply isn't possible. It has to be done the day before. So we've lost a lot of the ability to bring a minister to the House of Commons and put them on the spot for something that has just happened. And that, I think, has really impacted on scrutiny. And then, as I say, these very short time limits for speeches, these 3-minute time limits, mean you simply can't work your argument up. Often an argument is very nuanced. An argument that you have against a government policy is something that you need time to develop. You can't do that in 3 minutes. And so I think those two things have meant that the government hasn't been scrutinised in the way they would. You know, ministers have said they know exactly who's going to ask a question in advance, and they can probably therefore guess what the question is going to be. There's nothing there that puts them on the spot right at that last minute. And I think that's what we want to look at if there was to be any move towards keeping hybridity in the future or reinstating hybridity. How could we make sure we had that in that level of spontaneity?
Thank you, Karen. David, would you like to come in on that?
Well, yes, I'll give a different view if I may. Of course, I come from a different house and I know that the procedures are not in all respects comparable. But I think we've done a fantastic job of holding the government to account during the lockdowns in the ways that really matter. Number one, that's revising bills. Look what we did to the Internal Market Bill. Part 5 of the Internal Market Bill, the bit that was said to contravene international law, we removed from the bill, and we did it at committee stage, and then we did it again. You know, these things don't happen easily, but they happened. The other way we do it is in committee. Now, sitting in a virtual committee with the minister at the other end of a dusty horseshoe, you can just about make out their features, but with the minister staring into a camera, there really is no escape. And my own sense is we did just as good a job of questioning ministers, and our reports, for example, on the Brexit deal were just as hard-hitting as reports reached in other circumstances. Karen's other point about the 3-minute speeches, I'm sure she's right about the Commons. All I would say about the Lords is that although in the initial months of lockdown, we found there were more people applying to speak, with the result that speeches did sometimes have to be shorter. By the spring of this year, that had quietened down. We had the same number of oral interventions. The difference was they came from a wider variety of peers. And we started hearing from peers who, perhaps for reasons of distance or other reasons, we didn't used to see very much in the House, who were speaking up on things that they really knew about. So I would say, I mean, it's odd, you know, I'm not part of the government. I think we did a good job of holding the government to account.
Fantastic, thank you. Oh yes, Karen, please.
I'll just come back and just to say, I mean, I agree, David, and I think that, you know, there has been a lot of scrutiny. I think the question is, has it been as effective? And in some cases, I think it has. In some cases, I think the way that the hybrid parliament has worked, so for select committees, for example, have been able to operate in a much more flexible way with more participation from members than perhaps is possible if you all have to physically meet in the room together. And I think that that has meant, so there are some upsides, don't get me wrong. And I'm not saying that it's all bad. I'm just saying that there are some bits where in the Commons, I would want to look at those particular issues to try and make sure that we could use technology, which I believe is there. We could use the technology to overcome where we did have those problems. And just one final point, of course, the government decides in the House of Commons what we debate and when we debate it, and therefore they can make sure that there isn't time for scrutiny if they want to.
Thank you, Karen. Rasham, if virtual measures were retained as an option for all MPs, it may mean that MPs spend a lot more time in their constituencies if they wish. Do you think that could help to erode the concept that MPs are detached Westminster elites who aren't particularly interested in their constituents?
I think yes and no. I'll give you the politician's answer there. I think in some ways it's really great, but I've obviously not been an MP. I have fought 2 campaigns though, 2 elections. And the reality about being in the constituency is that unless you are really, really top notch with your social media and paying to get that boosted to reach out to other people, your ability to interact with people in your constituents is not generally seen by more than the people at the event and maybe others following you on your social media stream. So yes, I think it's fantastic for making sure the MP is really aware of local issues, is really tied into their local community, and is really, really aware of what's happening. And for all those reasons, I think spending more time in the constituency is hugely beneficial for democracy, really valuable to make sure that the MP is always on top of the issues that are happening. The reason I say no partly is because we often see in the media pictures of the chamber, lists of who bothered to turn up, even when we know that MPs are not in the chamber because they're in a select committee meeting or because they're working on something else or back in their constituency. And so I think the challenge is as an individual MP, you have a much smaller following and smaller platform in some ways than the media. And I think if I felt confident that the media would work to make sure that MPs were not being called lazy or suggesting that they couldn't be bothered to turn up to a debate, then I would think actually this is a fantastic solution for getting you more into your constituency as an MP. But I do worry that we'll see more and more MPs maligned as not bothering to turn up for debates or not bothering to be in Parliament with a picture of an empty chamber. Then we will see the, oh look, this MP has been in their constituency 30 more days this year because of virtual Parliament than they were last. So I think the reality and the perception will be different because of the way it's potentially represented by the media. And I think in terms of coming across as Westminster elites, of course, it's an upward battle. It's hard when you are always in Westminster to not be called a Westminster elite. So I think there are challenges around that perception, but the more time an MP can spend with their constituents, the more likely they are to represent them and their issues. So yeah, I think that's great for that.
Thank you for that nuanced answer, Rushan. Karen, what are your thoughts? Do you think that MPs being able to participate virtually and spend more time in their constituencies, will that improve their relationships with their constituents?
So I think there's lots of ways you can improve your relationship with your constituents, but let's not forget that there is only one person from each constituency who is allowed to participate in Westminster, and that is the Member of Parliament. That is the job we're elected to do. We should never forget that. And yes, we need to be absolutely embedded in our constituencies, understanding constituents' concerns, understanding what the problems are so that we can make relevant contributions. But nobody else is going to speak in Parliament on behalf of our constituents. Nobody else is able to. And so we have great convening power. We can bring people together. We have great power to make people make decisions that we maybe would like them to make on behalf of our constituents. But let's be clear, MPs have no money to spend and really actually have no power to make decisions. The decisions that are made on the things that matter to constituents are largely made by external organisations, be they local authorities or regulators or other organisations that manage the way that we run our lives. And an MP can help to persuade. But actually, the best way to help to persuade any organisation that they're doing the wrong thing is to speak in Parliament. And so I would be really opposed to any suggestion that somehow we become better MPs by spending more time in our constituencies. And the other thing I'll just say about, and I talked about the blurring of lines. So this afternoon, after I finish doing this, I have calls with my local health board to discuss the reopening of the minor injuries unit at my local hospital. I've got discussions with my constituents about some of their constituency issues, which I normally used to only able to do face-to-face on a Friday. I'm now doing it over Zoom and Teams and all the other ways of doing it. So it has allowed MPs to be able to do their work on across the whole 5 days of the working week. And in the case of MPs, it's a 7-day working week, but across the 5 days that most people are working in a more effective way. But that does then have a knock-on impact on Parliament because I'm doing those meetings, I'm not able to participate in the debates. And you've got to get that balance right. So I would say always, as any MP, Parliament has to be the focus of what you do. And you're doing it on behalf of your constituents, and never forget that. But it's about actually speaking out for constituency in Parliament in the best way you can.
Thank you, Karen. Jessica, Rushan mentioned that virtual measures might lead to MPs feeling pressure to work while unwell, while on maternity leave. Does that concern you too? And what sort of policies do you think could be put in place to prevent that sort of presenteeism or pressure?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've had this discussion a few times in discussing the report and the kind of experience of the hybrid parliament. Yeah, we need to be cautious as well of that kind of idea of getting 2 tiers of MPs, and that there is this value put on, as you called it, presenteeism, right? There's this kind of idea perhaps that the good parliamentarian is a present parliamentarian, a physically present one. And we're very much seeing that come through in the debates about hybridity and in the government response to hybridity. And I think, you know, part of that is cultural change. And I'm just in my approach to political science, quite a big believer in institutional change to cause cultural change. So if we put in the changes, and obviously it's not an immediate process, but the hope is that we get cultural change where it is more accepted, which also aligns with what we've been talking about. As David said, there's going to be these changes across all sorts of different industries as well, right? The kind of the good worker being the physically present worker is probably changing across a lot of industries. But in the report, we emphasize the need for consistent monitoring and consistent data and discussion of how any measures that are put in work, right? And that is key to so much of kind of institutional reform, and so much of our monitoring of kind of equality and representation is it's good data. And I'm not just saying that as a political scientist who loves data, but it's about you know, if we see that there seems to be an effect of difference in who's getting promoted, or who's getting you know, who's entering cabinet or shadow cabinet, or who's receiving you know, more accolade for their time, then we can look at, okay, what's going on with these measures? How can we mend them? How can we learn from best practice elsewhere where it seems to be working, and that kind of thing. But you know, at the moment, if you're on maternity, well, MPs still don't have proper maternity leave, right? So already you have a pressure to be there physically already, due to all the informal mechanisms, right? You have to go and ask to be the exception if you have any need to not be physically present, or something, for instance, that you may need food or water in the chamber because you have a condition that means you need to eat or drink regularly. And you have to go and ask to be that exception. And that's actually probably much more of a pressure than there being systems in place. And then we can check how these systems are influencing our representation.
Thank you, Jessica. Gresham, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think it is hugely important about the institutional change and cultural change, but I'm also a trustee of the Fawcett Society, so we do a huge amount of work on kind of gender inequality at work. And the challenge that I want to raise, and I don't know if anyone has thoughts or ideas or suggestions, is that often you get kind of benevolent discrimination where people think they're doing something helpful to a young working mum, and they make decisions on their behalf about what work they can and can't take on. So you'll often hear that you know, a senior manager doesn't offer a promotion or a particular project or opportunities to somebody who has young children, often women, because they think they're doing them a favor by not putting that on them. And so I worry that we will have men and women taking, you know, asking to use this vote from home system. And how do we tackle the benevolent non-promotion? How do we say, and how do you account for it when somebody doesn't get made a PPS or doesn't get promoted because the thinking is, but they have caring responsibilities, that's why they don't come in on Mondays, because they have to do X, Y, Z, or they're too ill to do it, so we shouldn't. And I absolutely agree with you, Jessica. Of course, tracking things and monitoring them is really important, but that is so hard when it's nuanced and often subconscious. It's not even often a conscious, like, Jessica doesn't come in, that's why I haven't promoted her, that we can track. And it's often very hard to get, you know, it's not like the PM outlines his reasons for why he's chosen to promote people or why people are PPSs. And so I think theoretically and conceptually, yes, of course, we could track it and do something about it. But the reality is that I think we will see decisions made on people's behalf that we aren't ever privy to be able to track and change.
I mean, absolutely. But I think at the moment, the fact that everything relies on, you know, usual channels and informal mechanisms, that there's much more scope for that kind of decision making and discrimination when everything is done through these kind of, you know, back channels and usual networks, right? And we're not going to eliminate bias in any way, right? I mean, I hope we could. That'd be lovely. But I think that at the moment what we can do is maybe reduce the scope for having that discrimination, and the, you know, like I said, people not being willing to come forward to ask for certain things. Sorry, Karen, you.
No. All I wanted to say was when the procedure committee looked at the, so we had the pilot of proxy voting for baby leave, as it was called, and by baby leave we mean maternity, paternity, but also for those in adoption and also for those with miscarriages, because it's really important that this is all taken into account. And we looked at the use of we have Member Hub, David, you have Peer Hub, so we have Member Hub, which is what we used for our remote voting. We looked at whether that would be a better alternative to actually having a full proxy for those on baby leave. Actually, the trouble with that, the Member Hub, is you're still on call. You're still going to get that phone buzzing, and it might be the moment you've just managed to get the baby to sleep and you're having your first sit down for the whole day. And we've, anybody who's had a baby will know that that is the moment you really, really don't want your phone to buzz and say, you now need to log in and vote. So we were really keen to make sure that proxy votes were introduced for or kept for those on baby leave. Now, we've never looked at whether proxy votes should be extended to those with caring responsibilities or illness. And I'm sure we will end up looking at that once we get through the pandemic. And just to so you know, breaking news, the Leader of the House has just announced that the orders regarding the way the House operates during the pandemic will be extended to the summer recess. So maybe I was thought leadership on that one earlier in the session when we suggested it was a good thing to do.
One final point to that as well, thinking about those decision making, is also we need to think about who's making those decisions, right? And the better representation we have, and the better representation we have higher up in Parliament and in the different places in Parliament, then that is one way that we can address that these kind of informal bias will be reduced.
Thank you. David, there's been a discussion today about the loss of spontaneous interactions due to virtual measures. Of course, much of the work of politics does take place via informal personal conversations. Does that concern you?
I'm tempted to ask if you've ever spent any time in the House of Lords. I don't think spontaneity is our most obvious characteristic, but one thing that opponents of all this often say is that in virtual proceedings, it's just people reading a speech onto a screen, whereas in the chamber, they are wonderfully fluent and taking the ideas as they come. And in my experience, at least in our chamber, it's just not like that at all. If you're speaking in the chamber, then you might get on the train in the morning with clutching your speech in your hand. And if you can read your own handwriting, you might be able to, make a few amendments in the chamber which just about translate into what you actually say. If you're sitting on a screen, you have complete freedom to start again, to amend, to delete paragraphs, to do a bit of Googling and say, well, this is how they do it in New Zealand, to build it in. And I make a point when I speak virtually of referring to sort of 8 or 10 previous speakers, just to show that it is no less spontaneous than actually speaking in the chamber. I'm afraid with us, speeches, debates of all kinds, whether real life or virtual, are sometimes a procession of people reading stuff out they've written before, which is not particularly ideal. But I really don't think it's any more likely to be like that if it's virtual. And the other point Karen raised is intervening on each other in debates. It's one of the things that makes the Commons such fun to listen to. It happens much less in the Lords, and the people who do it tend to be people who enjoyed debating at university or who look back to their glory days in the Commons. It's not a common feature, but I mean, if the software can be tweaked to make it possible, yes, I'm all for it. But no, I don't think we're looking at a big reduction in the Lords, but that's perhaps because we're looking at quite a low base.
Thank you, David. Rashid, we have a question from the audience for you, an anonymous question that asks, what specific challenges would women face in a permanent hybrid parliament system?
Sure, I think that's a great question. And of course, it depends on each relationship, each constituency, each association, what you're expecting and what you're not. The women we speak to at Women to Win, of course, are people who want to become MPs. Some of them have stood before multiple times. Some of them were MPs, lost their seats and are trying again. And of course, we're in regular contact with current female MPs as well. And it's a real mix. I think the challenge comes from, of course, a lot of societal and cultural pressure on female MPs, especially those with children, that they are somehow not being a good enough mother if their children have to be looked after by the father or the partner or whoever the other parent or caregiver is. And I think when we speak to candidates about their thoughts on a hybrid parliament, it's an interesting mix. Women who have children seem to favour hybrid parliament more, I think partly because they actually have had kids and recognise the extreme challenge of how you're an MP with a breastfeeding child, or how you manage the commute with a very young child, or 2 children, 3 children. But younger women, especially those without children, are much more concerned about the 2-tier parliament, and if they are to go on to become MPs and have children, will the pressure from their own families, their partners, society be such that, well, you have the option to go home and vote from there whilst looking after your child, so you should go and do that. And if you are doing that and looking after children, does that mean you're no longer able to focus or contribute fully to the debate? Does that mean you become that 2nd-tier MP that I raised concerns about, whereby Parliament goes backwards a step in terms of being a mostly male place because it's more women taking up the option to vote from home? Of course, we won't know because we haven't really tested it outside of COVID, and I just have to be clear, I think the hybrid working during a pandemic has been fantastic for making sure democracy works and people can vote even when they have to isolate or have health conditions. But I think this concern about women's working in Parliament goes beyond COVID. If it's no longer a health requirement, how do we ensure that it's not the women going home to vote and the men staying and doing that networking?
Thank you, Rushem. We have another audience question which has come through. David's obviously mentioned tweaks that can be made to software, and our audience question asks, if tech can remove heckling and distractions, slightly controversial word there, surely it can be used to improve rather than impede parliamentary debates. Jessica, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, on the debates and the technology, I think that there's several sides to it, right? And I think we've talked about how I liked what David said, right? So the technology is worst it's ever going to be, right? We can use it to create better. And that, so in terms of spontaneity, we can build that in. But there's definitely also, it's a really interesting point, because I think we need to be careful of thinking that the great orator and that kind of great debate is what is always happening in Parliament. And it's not always necessarily the case. And also is the kind of type of MP that every MP wants to be. And there are different types of MPs. And it also is a kind of atmosphere that for some people is exclusionary, that they may not be used to. And we know that from the experience of kind of new MPs coming in, from research around that. It can be a very different atmosphere, a very intimidating atmosphere if you're not from kind of some of the usual backgrounds of MPs. And so having a more perhaps I don't know how to put this, but yes, potentially maybe less distractions or a less adversarial style of debate, if it's done in a hybrid or virtual fashion, may help certain groups in terms of an easier potentially entry to Parliament or easier experience of Parliament. I just also before wanted to bring on the previous point about women's experience of hybridity, to also say that we also shouldn't think that a hybrid Parliament is a silver bullet that's going to solve all of Parliament's problems in terms of representation. And of course, we have a barrage of other reforms in terms of how we can help Parliament become a diversity-sensitive Parliament or a gender-sensitive Parliament. I'd point towards my co-author, Sarah Childs' report, The Good Parliament. The Women and Equalities Committee are currently doing a review of how gender-sensitive the UK Parliament is. And so there should be other policies, other reforms that could help women who want to, or men and women who want to balance childcare and work, for instance, potentially sitting hours or a creche, etc.
Thank you, Jessica. Karen, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. I think David wanted to come in as well. I think we've all got something to say on this, but I wanted to make the point Jessica's just made, actually, that this isn't the only answer. There's so many barriers to people becoming an MP that we shouldn't think that it's just about if we give hybridity to people, that it will all work. And I think we should also remember that when I became chair of the procedure committee, I did so on the back of some of the most novel procedural changes that had happened as a result of the debates around Brexit. And I thought I was coming into a sort of, what would now be a nice sort of steady committee where we would just continue looking at how procedure worked, and to not to think that I'd actually take over the committee at the point that we were going to change our procedures in the most fundamental way that we've done for 600 years. And I think we have to remember that about a quarter of the Parliament, and this isn't a criticism of anybody who was elected in 2019, a fantastic group of new MPs who are eager and keen and really want to be part of the debate, and were elected on the basis that they were going to be part of this fully physical Parliament, have found that they got 3 months of it. And then it's been this extraordinary time that we've all faced. And I think we've all got to perhaps go back, and I think I said this earlier, it's really important we go back to what the procedures were before, because actually I think you can't assess where we are today and have been for the last 15 months and compare it to the previous situation until we've all had a time of being used to the previous situation. And that means working out how it is without a call list, and you're still sat there at 9:30 on a Monday night, and you've been in for the opening and you're still there for the closing and you haven't made your speech. It means understanding that you can bob 200 and something times during a UQ, but you may not get called at all, whereas at least if you're on the list, you know you're going to get called. It will mean actually people seeing how the debate works and whether it really is truly interactive or whether it is still people reading speeches into the record. We need to go back and try that, and we need to see how that works for a period of time, and then Parliament needs to have the time to look at what it wants to do for the future and what we can take from that. But I think David's right when he says the technology can't be any worse. It's only ever going to get better, and we should keep remembering that when we're assessing these things.
Thank you, Karen. David, did you want to come in?
My counter to that, picking up Jessica's point about we've had the great opportunity to conduct an experiment, not for good reasons, but we really have conducted an experiment. I don't think the experiment is finished. It's not time to go back to the old ways yet, because we've only looked at how this works during pandemic conditions when most people have simply had to stay at home. I think what we need to see is how hybrid proceedings work when people can choose whether to come in or whether to stay at home. It may be that everyone will love it so much they'll all flock back to Westminster, or it may be that there'll be a huge groundswell of opinion, as there is in many other jobs, to be able to work at home 2 or 3 or 4 days a week. I think ideally we should continue this experiment until the end of the year, and that's the point at which we should vote whether we go back to the old ways or whether we embrace at least some of the new.
Thank you, David. Resham.
So it's just a point, actually, because I thought it was interesting. Karen mentioned the 2019 intake, and I have a lot of friends who were elected in 15, 17 and 19, because I joined the list in 2014. And what's interesting is what I've heard the most from the 2019 intake is about, I mean, Parliament is a challenging place to work. Politics is a challenging industry. We know that from studies on online abuse and media focus and a total lack of privacy and all of these elements. I mean, it's an incredible job. It's why so many of us want to do it, but it doesn't come without some significant challenges. And the thing I've heard a lot from the 2019 intake is that when they speak to kind of previously elected MPs, those MPs say that being in Parliament together is not just great for collaboration and for making change and debate and asking important questions, but it's actually great for resilience, because you have other people there who understand what you're going through, who can offer support, who can offer mentorship, who can guide you through a particularly challenging, abusive spate on Twitter, or, if you've said something that's been misinterpreted and it's all over the papers, or if you've said something, and actually I think that's a really valuable part of Parliament, that actually having that in-person group of people means that you build that teamwork, that cohesive group of MPs that can support each other through challenging times. And I think what I hear a lot from my 2019 friends is that this job is much harder than they expected, because they suffer alone, and it's harder to not have those lunch times with other people where you can go up to somebody and go, really sorry, I saw you Twitter trending, know you're having a hard time, this happened to me 3 years ago, I'm here for you. And I do wonder whether we'll see more of the newer MPs standing down after one term, because they just haven't had that support that other MPs have had in the same way. And I know older elected MPs, I don't mean older by age, I mean earlier elected MPs, have been doing their best to be supportive, but I just don't think it's the same to be able to offer that support online or by WhatsApp, no matter how hard people try.
Thank you, Resham. Well, I think we have time for one more question, which I'll give to Jessica. How significant is the danger that if a hybrid option is permanently introduced, people might just throw up their hands and say, job done, let's check improving inclusivity off the list?
I mean, you're right. Yeah, I suppose that's a risk by the fact that, you know, in this event, we've clarified that it's not a silver bullet that's going to solve all issues of diversity and inclusion. And that really comes down to that we're not going to allow that to happen, right? There will be people, there'll be researchers, there'll be groups like Fawcett Society, as already been mentioned, who will continue to campaign to make sure that Parliament is the best it can be in terms of being diversity sensitive and gender sensitive. And also Parliament itself is signed up to international standards on how it's supposed to be diversity sensitive and gender sensitive. And so we need to make sure and hold it to account in terms of meeting those standards. And hybridity may very well help reach some of those standards, but it may not help with all of them.
Thank you, Jessica. Well, that is our time. Many thanks to all our panelists, to the audience for joining us this lunchtime and sending in all their questions, and to the Centenary Action Group for partnering with us on this event.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.